Herzlich willkommen, schönen guten Abend. Danke, dass ihr alle gekommen seid zum NPA 149. Ihr seht, die Zahl wird immer größer und zum Schluss werden wir auch euch eine Jubiläumsfolge ankündigen dürfen. Freuen wir uns schon drauf. Heute sind wir in der frisch renovierten Raumstation Seabase oder auf der Raumstation, soll man ja eher sagen. Ihr seht, es sieht alles schon noch ein bisschen frischer aus als sonst. Und deswegen können wir jetzt auch gleich direkt einsteigen. Und herzlich willkommen auch noch an alle im Stream. Wenn ihr gerade zuschaut, seid ihr wahrscheinlich per PeerTube dabei. Ich lade euch auch herzlich dazu ein, per Hashtag NPA 149 live noch ein bisschen mitzureden oder wenn ihr Fragen habt, die auch dort zu schreiben. Wer letztes Mal hier war, als ich das Vergnügen hatte, den NPA zu moderieren, hat da schon einiges über Vorratsdatenspeicherung und Going Dark etc. gehört. Und auch heute wird es wieder um die Vorratsdatenspeicherung gehen, genauso wie um das Unsicherheitspaket. Wir haben als SpeakerInnen heute erst Chloé von EDRi. Ich werde sie gleich noch anmoderieren. Sie wird uns etwas zur Vorratsdatenspeicherung auf europäischer Ebene erzählen. Danach werde ich euch ein bisschen was dazu erzählen, wie ihr selber aktiv werden könnt, um der EU-Kommission ein klares Nein zur Vorratsdatenspeicherung zu geben. Danach hören wir was zum sogenannten Sicherheitspaket oder wie wir es bezeichnen, das Unsicherheitspaket von PIA, von Algorithm Watch. Und zum Schluss werden wir euch noch für alle Fans des Fediverse ein kleines Schmankerl anbieten können. Und ohne lange Umschweife darf ich dann jetzt auch schon Chloé anmoderieren. Chloé ist Senior Policy Advisor bei EDRi, unserem europäischen Dachverband. Sie beschäftigt sich mit so Themen wie Europol, Protect EU oder eben auch mit der Vorratsdatenspeicherung. Und sie wird uns jetzt einen Ausblick geben. Deswegen bitte ich euch, sie wird auf Englisch vortragen. So, without any further ado, please clap and welcome Chloé from EDRi.
Wie kann ich den Slide?
Yes.
Hallo, guten Abend. Es freut mich, hier zu sein. Danke für die Einladung. Genau, danke schön. Meinen Vortrag werde ich auf Englisch halten, aber wenn Sie Fragen auf Deutsch haben, gerne beantworte ich sie am Ende. Ja. So, the EU data retention zombie, what is the EU cooking up for us in the coming year? Unfortunately, I'm bringing bad news from Brussels. Let's see what they have. For the speech tonight, or for the presentation, I'm going to go through a brief history of data retention, a refresher for some of you. You probably know about the topic, but for others, maybe it's good to have like the basics in mind. I'll give you a really brief overview of what's the situation of data retention in Europe, not just in Germany, but like the entire 27 member states. What is coming up? What are the debates at European level? What are the discussions that are happening? What are the police arguments the law enforcement authorities pushing for? What can we expect concretely? So this is the part of the presentation where I'm going to go into speculation mode. And what are the threats attached to those proposals which are flying around? And then lastly, what we can do, which is going to be a nice kind of segue into Konstantin's presentation on how you can mobilize against it. So I start right into the topic. What is data retention? It's a legal requirement, an obligation put into the law for providers of electronic communication services to retain certain types of data about their users, but solely for the purpose of law enforcement, for subsequent access to it after. What data are we talking about? It's mainly traffic and location data about online activities or communication which are made through an electronic service, so it's quite broad. And metadata is very well known to be as sensitive as the content of communication. So there is this kind of wrong idea, especially in the minds of policymakers when we meet them, that metadata, so the data about the communication is less sensitive than content data, and this is like this myth that we have to kind of bust every time when we talk about this topic. What providers? It's mostly telecom providers, telecom companies historically when we talk about data retention, but it can cover some of the email providers and some private messaging. Again, I'm talking about what happened in the past, because I will come to it later, and what's new. And retention is beyond what is necessary for the provision of the service. In EU law, you have this idea that you cannot retain, theoretically, under the e-privacy directive, data about your users more than necessary for billing purposes. You need to issue a bill to your customers to get money, whatever, or for technical reasons. Data retention is making a derogation to this principle and allows providers to retain that data solely to serve the police interest, law enforcement interest. A brief history of data retention. The demands from states and police can be traced back from the 90s, when I was still not born. So it's a long, long history, but it really got traction in the 2000s after the terrorist attacks in Madrid and London. And then 9/11 is also a very important milestone for that debate, where it got pushed by several Western governments. At EU level, we got a first instrument in 2006, which was adopted despite huge mobilization. And later, the Court of Justice of the European Union received a case brought by one of our members from EDRi, from Ireland, Digital Rights Ireland, and the courts annulled that directive. What happened then? Basically, the member states saw the judgment and then ignored it. They refused to give up their national legal frameworks, their national laws allowing for mass data retention, so the retention of all metadata about every user ever. So what happened? They kept all their national laws, so the directive at EU level was annulled, didn't exist anymore. But since it's a directive, it required member states to transpose it into their national legal system, which means you kill kind of the head, but you still have the legs, so to say. Which led then to a lot of litigation case. People started litigating against all the national laws to bring them down. And so you had a lot of judgment also going up the way to the Court of Justice of the European Union. And basically, at the end, we have a very rich body of case law from the Court of Justice, very specific and detailed. And every time the position of the CJU, of the Court of Justice, was very clear, you cannot have mass data retention. However, the persistence of member states made it so that we, as EDRi, we interpret the latest judgment as a cave-in or as a weakening of certain standards. So unfortunately, I would say that member states' strategy to just keep harassing the Court of Justice to change its mind on data retention starts to work and starts to be successful. The result of all of this mess, especially member states refusing to comply with the Court of Justice, is legal unclarity. Like, there's so many judgments, it goes into so much details, member states refuse to apply it. Some national laws are still in place, but they are against EU law. So providers are like, okay, should I retain the data or not? The national law says yes, but EU law says no. And you have a huge fragmentation among member states. So some of them have it, some of them don't. I will come back to this in a minute. A recap of what the Court of Justice says. This is the kind of the legalistic part of the presentation. But basically, you cannot have general and indiscriminate data retention of all traffic and location data, even for combating serious crime, because it's contrary to EU law, and in particular, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's the basis. I'm not going to talk about the national security case, because that's way too complex for tonight. But at least we have this baseline. You cannot do mass data retention, even for the purpose of combating serious crime. Now, as I mentioned just before, the Court of Justice started to kind of give in to certain requirements of the member states. And so as There were several judgments coming in. They started to refine a little bit their position. What they do accept is so-called targeted data retention. So you can target certain individuals according to certain criteria or geographical areas. Now, the requirement for doing this is that you have to pick criteria to select people or areas in an objective manner. Good luck. It's really hard, and even member states, governments, which is very surprising, to be fair, are saying it would lead probably to discrimination. So I'm like, okay, even the police says that. It's probably going to be, if ever it's implemented, it's probably going to be bad. And then you have the option from the Court of Justice to say, like, okay, quick freeze is good. Quick freeze is proportionate. If you don't know what quick freeze is, it's basically a preservation order. As soon as you know that you need a certain type of data within an investigation, so you have to have a specific investigation open, then you can send a request to the provider, please freeze that data so I can access it later. And the court also accepts, again, as a cave-in, as a compromise, the general and indiscriminate retention for certain type of data. So they started to say it's okay to retain all IP addresses for the purpose of identification. And civic identity data, what is that? Good question. It's not solved by lawyers, unfortunately, but it's basically everything that you give to subscribe to the service. Your name, your billing address, your email address, if you have to provide one, probably yes. A lot of things that telecom providers ask you when you subscribe to the service. I guess you are interested in knowing a little bit more about what kind of data we're talking about. Again, that's historically what was in the old data retention directive from 2006. So the scope included all the kind of call detail records, so all the information about calls and text messages, the sender, the recipient, the timestamp, the location of each device. The location data, currently we have more and more accuracy, almost close to a GPS accuracy, and we're really able to tell with precision, like within hundreds of meters, where you are located. And we no longer need, because of the evolution, the development of 4G and 5G, we really can trace an entire location trail for each individual based on just on your phone. Source IP address for internet access was already in the scope, and also, as I mentioned, the kind of subscriber identity, all those kind of technical information when you subscribe to a service and when you use it. Why it's a problem? I hope you know why it's a problem, but again, it's a refresher. It is an encroachment in the right to privacy, in the fundamental rights to privacy. It's not me saying it, although we are saying it too. It's the Court of Justice. They are basing this assessment that it is a very important and serious interference with people's right to privacy because it creates the feeling of being under constant surveillance. All your data is always retained about you, even if you're not suspect of a crime, for potential subsequent access by the police. There is a lack of statistical evidence about it. It means that legislators have never proven that there is a link between solving crime and data retention. So we are always fighting about the fact that the measure hasn't proven to be necessary for the pursuit of law enforcement objectives. There's been some studies trying to figure out the link between data retention and crime clearance rates, and it never got to really substantial and reliable results that there is like kind of a difference between member states who have data retention and those who don't, or even within one member state throughout time when it has data retention and it stopped having this possibility. There isn't a huge difference in terms of crime clearance rates. So the impact on actually providing justice is not even proven. Mass surveillance, everybody's concerned. You got it in the name, mass data retention. Everybody is treated as a potential suspect in the future, which is very problematic if you ask me. It has a chilling effect. This is kind of a point related to the first bullet point about like this feeling of being under constant surveillance might create within you like this feeling of maybe I'm not going to exercise my other fundamental rights to what I would like to do. Like I would not probably join a protest, I might not join an association, etc., etc. It also bears some cybersecurity risk. I don't know how to call it elsewhere, or digital risk. Those are like kind of massive amounts of personal data that can be very intimate and sensitive, that are just retained and vulnerable to cyber attacks. And when you know that telecom operators are often the target of attacks, this becomes a problem. What's the situation now? This is very scary as a slide, I acknowledge that, but I'm going to get you through it. Basically, Eurojust, which is the source at the bottom, it's the judicial cooperation agency of the European Union. And that agency did a mapping in November 2024, which is kind of the latest overview that we have that is solid and reliable for where are the different member states are at in terms of data retention. What you need to know is basically 15 member states, which is huge. It's more than half of it, of their total number, didn't make any significant change to their national laws following key judgments from the Court of Justice. So basically, the Court of Justice said, you need to do this, this, and that, and member states were like, okay, done. And they didn't change anything in their national laws. 12 member states did make some change. Did they make some change in line with the Court of Justice? Not sure. So that needs to be like kind of investigated, but at least they responded to the CJU judgment. It's quite striking that 3 member states have indicated that they basically have exactly the same copy-paste from the old directive, which is declared invalid and contrary to EU law. So basically, they're really like against what is allowed under EU law. 4 member states have no data retention in place back in November 2024. Germany, for how long? I don't know, you tell me. Netherlands, Romania, and Slovenia. So those are actually in line and compliant with EU law by not having a data retention law. And then some try to implement this idea that I just mentioned some slides before of targeted data retention according to individuals or geographical areas. Now, the problem with that is that if you look at how, for example, Belgium and Denmark, which are the 2 first mentioned, implemented targeted data retention, if you look at the threshold that they took or the criteria, it's basically covering the entire territory of their member states. So it's targeted in the name, but not targeted in practice. What's coming up? As I told you before, the situation is that we have a legal fragmentation, and a lot of member states / law enforcement authorities are not happy with that situation. And therefore, there is a new momentum at EU level to have a new EU instruments to try and harmonize a little bit data retention rules. It's unclear if it's going to be a directive or a regulation. Those are EU jargon to say, is it going to be an instrument that guides member states, or is it going to be like more binding in terms of like you have to follow these rules? Those are the 2 choices. It depends how the Commission, the European Commission, is going to approach the topic. Von der Leyen confirmed in her political guidelines for this new mandate that she wants a new EU instrument, and she confirmed it in her mission letter to the Commissioner for Home Affairs, Magnus Brunner, aus Österreich, and he is in charge of updating law enforcement tools for access to digital information and rules on data retention. So you can see that the question of access and retention are very much linked in the debate. The Commission launched a process for consultation with a call for evidence, which is, again, EU jargon to say, send us your feedback about this topic in spring. Now we are at the stage of a questionnaire, which is called, in their language, public consultation. So they have a series of questions which we're going to come to in a moment, that you can answer to until the 12th of September. If you ever have 30 minutes free in your agenda, you can do so. And the legislative proposal, so the kind of end result, we're going to know it by Q1, so in the first 3 months of 2026. All of those plans were confirmed in the so-called Protect EU Internal Security Strategy. And you can see I kind of did a screenshot from the plans of the Commission that you can really see how it's connected to the whole question of law enforcement access to data. Because the first one is about a roadmap, so it's kind of like the general plans of the Commission on how to improve law enforcement access to personal data, and then data retention comes next. And as a third bullet point, by the way, they want to treat the question of encryption and how to access encrypted data, but this is not a topic for tonight. What are the police arguments? So when I am in Brussels and discussing in debates with police officers or police representatives, those are the arguments I'm hearing. And I'm going to try to explain them to you, so you know a little bit what we are up against. There is an absence of legal certainty, according to them, because of CJU rulings. So they say the CJU is constantly making rulings, and it changes its mind. And so it creates legal certainty because we don't know what is allowed, what is not allowed anymore. Now what we are saying is that there is legal certainty because you don't follow the CJU. So you're creating a situation where you should be doing something and you're not doing it. And therefore, everybody is like, which norm should I follow? They are also complaining about the unavailability of data. This is especially the case in cross-border criminal investigation. So for example, when one authority requires data from a service provider located in another jurisdiction, in another country, they go to that service provider and they're like, can you please hand me that data about this person who is a suspect in my case? And the service provider says, sorry, I deleted it already. So they complain about those kind of situations. They say that the procedures for access to that data are very difficult and bureaucratic. We say it's safeguards that they have to respect and the rule of law. They say that quick freeze, so the kind of solution that I mentioned before about this quick preservation and keep the data, freeze the data until I have done my access request, is not enough because it doesn't give access to historical data. So basically, it's like you have to know a little bit who's the suspect and then ask for the service provider to retain the data, but they can only retain the data as soon as they receive the order. They cannot like kind of go back 6 months. The data is already gone. So they also complain about this. There is this whole problem of dynamic IP addresses and CGNAT. You probably know better than I do, but basically behind one IP address can be several people. IP address changes are allocated to different subscribers depending on the time. And so member states kind of complain about this because they don't have access to the identity of the person if they have the IP address. They say in debates, in the public debate, there is an imbalance between privacy and human dignity. So when they say that, they're referring to the rights of victims of crimes. And so they say that there is too much emphasis on the right to privacy in those debates. Voilà. Do with that what you want. And then foreign companies, compliance with national laws, they basically complain that when a company is not located under their jurisdiction, it's harder to enforce orders. I'm going to go quickly through some of the proposals that were kind of flown around about what would this future EU instrument be about. There has been in the past this high-level group, so-called Going Dark. The real name is Law Enforcement Access to Data, or Effective Access to Data for Effective Law Enforcement, was the name. It was co-chaired by the Commission, but also the Presidency of the Council. So the member states in charge for 6 months of chairing the Council meetings. And it was composed of member state experts, mainly from prosecution offices, law enforcement authorities, Very few from a data protection or fundamental rights perspective were in that group. And their mission was kind of listing some recommendations for the Commission to improve EU law with regards to law enforcement access to data. And so they covered topics such as encryption, data retention, the enforcement of law enforcement measure abroad, etc., etc. But basically what you need to know is that they published this recommendation about data retention. I'm not going to go into the detail. What I want to point out is that this was a very, I want to show you this because it's the most kind of radical proposal from a police perspective. They want to widen the scope of providers that would be required to do data retention. So remember, I told you that this was specific providers, and especially like because it's from the 2000s, it was mainly telcos, telecom companies that were concerned. Now they want to force everybody who handles data to retain that data. So social media, web hosting, private messengers, anything that actually manages or processes personal data could be within the scope, but also and especially OTTs, so WhatsApp, Signal, Skype, if that doesn't exist anymore. But you get me, would be in the scope of this data retention obligation. They also are thinking of forcing those providers which do encrypt certain of the metadata to decrypt it for police access. And lastly, they want to force certain companies which don't collect enough data, such as Signal, to collect them, so they ensure identification of users. What can we expect in the Commission future proposal? In 2021, our member in the UK, Statewatch, which focuses a lot on transparency, access to documents, and trying to understand a little bit more what are the surveillance plans of the EU, they managed to get certain documents revealing the positions of member states on data retention and whether they want a new EU instrument. They've done it through a FOIA request, and we're really grateful to that because we can better understand what could be like proposed by the Commission. Basically, this is the kind of speculation that we have. Don't take it as granted, it might be completely different, but this is kind of our interpretation as EDRi of how member states are positioning themselves and how the Commission might respond to those positions. What we think is that the future EU rules, this EU instrument, is going to complement national data retention regime because many member states do not want to lower their standards and do more data protection and not repeal their mass data retention laws, basically. So they're scared that the harmonization at EU level would actually prevent them from doing mass data retention. So our hypothesis is that it's going to be only an EU instrument for the types of data for which the CGU has said, okay, you can do mass data retention, which I mentioned at the beginning, IP addresses, civic identity data. And then maybe there's going to be something about targeted data retention, but as we know, member states don't like it, as I told you, because they say that not practical, it cannot be easily enforced, and it might risk leading to discriminatory impacts. What we also fear is this enlargement of the scope of providers, which would cover really a wider aspect of online activities, notably, again, OTTs, and even maybe VPNs. Another speculation is, or at least what the Commission seems to be floating around, is having maybe a two-side approach or a two-tiered approach, one requiring soft law. So it means like measures that are not really binding, but like here are some guidelines for implementing data retention, and member states are supposed to follow it. Or legislative measures which are binding. It's really a question mark, and it's unclear how the Commission is going to decide. But basically, they would need to have an instrument on data categorization, so defining I told you about the fact that there is some controversy around what is the scope of the definition of civic identity data. It's the same for all the categories. There is always like controversy about what is traffic data, what is civic identity data, what is access data. There's new categories being created for the purpose of certain policies which don't always make sense with the technical reality. And so probably the Commission is going to work out some definition and some categorization. They're probably going to maybe do some soft law for forms, like just filling out forms on, I want this data, please. So providers are kind of receive an official template with a good logo on it and so on. You must know that some law enforcement agencies still send fax to service providers for accessing data. So that could be progress, maybe a welcome progress. Let's try to see the silver lining in this. Maybe some retention periods, again, on specific data categories. And then the Commission is suggesting also voluntary cooperation. So if service providers want to retain more data than they need, they would be like encouraged to do so. But we're like, no, because this is against the e-privacy directive, as I mentioned in the beginning. What are we doing as EDRi? We're preparing the fight because it's going to be a big one. We are contributing and playing fair game in the consultation process, so we're responding to every consultation format that the Commission has organized. We're trying to raise awareness about the topic. We're trying to kind of educate some of the groups that don't have the capacity or the expertise to understand this very technical topic. So we're trying to reach out to NGOs representing different interest groups, journalists, lawyers, sex workers, migrant organization, and so on and so forth, and trying to explain how this might impact everyone, but them in particular, because they are already over-policed and subject to more surveillance than the rest of the population. And then we're trying to produce also some advocacy materials for policymakers. Again, education is a big part of our role here, because most of them don't know. And we had in 2024 a new European Parliament. What can you do? You can contribute to the consultation I mentioned at the beginning. You can fill out this questionnaire. Be aware that it is very tricky. There is a lot of tricky questions that are framed and written in a way that bias you and bias your answer towards a certain answer that the Commission wants you to give them. So I will refer you to Constantine, who will guide you in how to respond to it without falling into the trap. You can raise awareness about the topic if you understand a little bit what is going on or what is at stake. You can talk about it around you in your collectives, in your organizations. You can mobilize widely. If you have even wider connections, try to think of actions that could be done. Keep pressure on the German government. That would help us at the European level. If one of the only member states who is compliant with EU law could remain so, it would be perfect. I know it's in the coalition Vertrag, but I have my hopes. And I'll take questions afterwards. Thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Please stay at the front, because people will now have a chance to ask questions. I will go with the microphone to you to give you the opportunity. Please raise your hand. I'm kind of blinded by the light, but I think I see someone over there.
Sorry, I have a question after.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. A lot of the information here is very new to me, and it's alarming to say the least. You mentioned some of the member states have targeted rules to retain this data. Did you maybe document, or do you have evidence of this targeted retention being directed at specific minority groups, such as immigrants or other minority groups like that?
So the approach that Belgium and Denmark have taken is not about individuals, or at least I think individuals that are suspected of serious crimes. So they have to be in a certain police database. But the main approach of those two countries has been according to geographical areas. So they define certain jurisdiction according to their own criteria. They have usually established a list of sensitive zones, so airports, any kind of transportation hubs, borders, any kind of critical infrastructure. So you have like one water station or like electricity grid. The entire area around it is covered by the retention, for example. And by adding all those, you almost cover the entire territory. But they also added this criteria of like they have those police zones, especially in Belgium. It's divided according to police zones where police forces have jurisdiction over them. And if this zone pass a certain threshold of crime per inhabitants per 3 years, then they're covered. But the threshold is so low, and the crimes that they count as crime in this are so vast, like they also include petty crimes such as theft or stuff like this, which are not serious crime according to the case law of the Court of Justice, then the territory is covered. And the fact that they took such a low threshold means like almost a former pirate from Germany, pirate MEP, did the math, and the entire territory of Belgium was covered. There was like maybe just like 1 pixel somewhere that wasn't covered, but it was ridiculous. It was, in practice, it was complete mass data retention. We don't have, to answer your question about like the discrimination and the kind of targeting of specific communities, if member states were to implement this targeted data retention according to individuals, they would rely on police database. And because we know police databases are inherently discriminatory because they're guided by racist police actions, we know that the communities that would be targeted are the same that you think. They're the marginalized ones, the ones that are over-policed, and so on.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. Do you already have a guess in which direction this proposal is going, like more like in the direction of legal binding or like a soft law? Or is it too early to like say something about that?
So as I said, we think that they're going to do the minimum that is allowed by the CGU, which are the mass data retention of source IP addresses. I think the CGU hasn't done anything or hasn't released any decision regarding port numbers, and therefore I think the Commission is going to try to push what it means source IP address to also include port numbers in order to enable identifications. And they're going to do civic identity data. So that's kind of the baseline that is allowed by the CGU, and I think that will be binding on all member states. Are they going to do data retention, targeted data retention? Our feeling is no, but maybe they will do some kind of directive, which means if some member state wants to do that, they can. They will enlarge the scope of providers. Again, that will be binding. Soft law, I think it's more the definition of data. The forms, that's easy. Guidance on the forms, like your form should have this, this, and that. Yeah, that's all I'm thinking now. I hope that answers your question. I think it's going to be a mix, basically.
Yeah, I have one question here. Is this what you presented today actually addressing what we were talking about in the past already and naming it chat control? Did I get that right? Is it somehow related, or if it's related, how is it maybe related?
There's a chat control expert wants to answer that. There are so many more experts on chat control in this room than me. So I'd like to offer some like national expert the floor.
Khaleesi, would you mind?
I'm not sure if I got the question correctly. Was the question that if it's connected to chat control in general?
Is it the same?
Oh, okay. So Protect EU, generally speaking, is connected to chat control because there's this technological roadmap that they started, and there is an expert group being put together for lawful access to encrypted communication right now. So it is connected to Protect EU, but it's not connected to data retention directly, I would say.
In terms of the technical aspect, we're not talking about the same thing. It's not the same data. So data retention is just the retention. It's just the retention. Although it's, as I said, it's already considered an interference with your right to privacy. I don't want to minimize that. But chat control is about scanning of private messages. So it's the content of the communication. It's done automatically, and it's also carried out by the provider. And then they have this obligation to proactively flag content that was detected as illegal to police authorities. Here, you don't have this automatic sharing with law enforcement. It's kind of you have to think about it as a measure to freeze all the data for a certain period of time. Under the old directive, it was 12 months. So you had all this data of everyone stored just in case they need access. But access is a different procedures. So it's not the same data, and it's not the same data processing. Awesome. Hi, Matthias.
Hi. Implementing data retention is not cheap, so I wonder what's the position of the telco providers on this matter?
Yes, the telcos are not happy. The telcos don't like it because it's more costs, and usually they lose in the legislative process in getting their costs reimbursed. So all the process of just storing the data, well, apparently it doesn't cost them a lot compared to their budget, but still they complain about this because all the operation that they need to do for this purpose, that's basically money that is not in their pocket. And then secondly, they also complain about access procedures. So really the mere fact of hiring someone responsible to receive the law enforcement request, to process it, to produce the data in an intelligible format and then send it, that costs time and money in salaries and in technical stuff. So they're usually not really keen on that. Those at national level, they also prefer when they abide by national rules rather than EU instrument. So generally, they're not so keen on that, but then you have the big ones, those who offer more cross-border services. And since this is kind of the trend of this proposal to kind of enlarge the scope of providers, you have, for example, Microsoft, who is very keen to have this because they offer services in all the member states and they would like to abide by one rule. So they prefer an EU instrument rather than 27 different rules. And so when I'm invited in Brussels, I often speak on the same panel as Microsoft because they're like, we need clarity, we need harmonization is so good. Yes, obviously for their own interest, it's good. Other providers such as Vodafone, I think, who has also several kind of branches across the EU, they're also keen on that. So as soon as you kind of have an international firm, they're quite keen on an EU harmonized framework.
Okay, thank you so much, Chloé. Please, another round of applause for Chloé.